Hello and welcome to our next tutorial. This is hopefully a simple enough tutorial. We're going to make a really basic game. It's going to have a whole range of properties. We're going to explore scoring, collision, movement, and a bit of physics. So the modeling in this will be really basic. We're going to make a game similar to Pong. Those of you who remember Pong. So at the moment we're in user perspective. We're going to press 1 on the numpad, 1, and then 5, so we're in front orthographic mode. So N for my properties, and I'm going to try and do this nice and quickly. So I'm going to take this cube, I'm going to scale it by 0.2 and then scale it on Z by 5. I'm going to call this pad 1. And it's going to be the paddle that we use for the game that the player can hit the ball with. And I want to move it along the x-axis, and I'll do that by 10. So there's my paddle there. I want to be able to move the paddle, so before I do that I have to change from Blender Render to Blender Game, and then to the logic editor. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some keyboard input. I'm going to press the up arrow. This is going to move the paddle up, and then I'm going to give it some motion, and the motion will be on the z-axis. It's going to go up, and we'll say 0.2. So that's we'll type up there so we know what it does, and we link the two of them together. And then we get this little white triangle, close them up, and repeat. Only this time it's going to go down. Okay, and we do the same over here, motion and down, and this is going to be at minus 0.2 to go in the opposite direction. So we'll link them up and we'll do a quick test. So we'll say P to play the game engine, and I'm going to press up key, down key. Okay, so that's decent velocity as well, so it's not too fast. Okay, so I'm going to go Shift D and duplicate. I left click there to place it. So now I've got two of them, they're just sitting on top of each other. And you can see that by default it is called the second one pad.001, so we'll call this pad 2, and we want this to be minus 10. The problem with this one is that it's got the same input, so if we go P, we move them both at the same time, not desirable, so we'll use W for the input for up and S for the input for down, and then we can test that. P, and then W and S, and then up and down. Happy days. Okay, so we have 2 paddles for our game. We'll go into the physics of those paddles, and we leave them as static. We don't want them to have any sort of physics, or if the ball hits them, we don't want them to sort of keel over or spin. We want them to be fairly solid, so we leave them as static. We can make them actors if we want. If you place that over here, it says objects are detected by the near and radar sensor. So if you had a radar in your game or a proximity sensor, then you need to turn that on and off if you want the object to be detected. So we're not interested in that. Ghost makes the object like a ghost. So if we have a ball, if the ghost is turned on, the ball would pass through it. So we don't want any of them. But we do want to say collision bounds box. Same for this one, collision bounds box, because it's a box. So I'm going to duplicate this. Well, again, Shift T, and I'm going to scale it on Z by 6, and then instead of it being at 10, we'll make it at 12. And I'm going to call, I don't want any of the logic, it's going to be my back wall, so I'll call it right wall. And I'm going to go Shift D. Actually, no, before I do that, I'm going to add a prop or a piece of logic to it. I'm going to say on collision. So when something hits this wall, send a message. Okay. Now, what do we want to send a message to? Well, we want to send a message to something that's going to hold our score. So I'm going to make a new object. I'm going to make an empty. There we go, there's my empty, and I'm going to call this game controller. So I'm going to click back here, and it's going to send a message to the game controller, and the message is going to be score. Now who's going to score here? This is player pad 2. So if he hits the ball and this guy misses it, then it's pad 2 that scores. So over here I'm going to go score pad 2. So that's the message. Now I'm going to duplicate this. Whoops. Shift D. I'm going to go up to its transform, make that -12. There it is there. And this is going to go score pad 1. So when he hits the ball and this guy misses it and it hits to here, this player here, so pad 1 is going to score. Yeah, that's all good. Now I want to put in sidewalls, so I'm going to go Shift D, rotate it 90 degrees. I don't need any of the game logic on the side. I can give it a position of 0, 0, 0. I need to move it up this way by 6, I think. Yeah, so 6. And then I need to scale it on, not on X, no, on Z. So 12. And we'll call this top wall. Now this was called right wall, so this should be called left wall. Important that we label things or we'll lose track here of what all the objects are. So I'm going to duplicate this. It's going to have a position of -6, and we're going to call this bottom wall. Very good. Now we need to add in a plane. So I want to put my cursor back here. My cursor is over here now. I must have clicked there. So I go Shift S, cursor to selected. So it's in the middle. And now I'm going to add a mesh, which is a plane, or X90, so I can rotate it so it's flat. And I'm going to scale it up. I just did that by eye. Scale it on X, so it's bigger than the game area. I'm going to move this GY so it's just at the back here, and I'm going to call it the base. Okay. Now what's that for? That is to stop the ball from flying off that way on the y-axis, leaving our game. Now what I want is I want it to be static, so it has collision, but I want it to be invisible in the game. I also want it to be invisible in this viewport, and how I do that is I set it to be a wireframe only. So I'm going to do that again in a minute, but first I'm going to make a second one. So I'm going to Shift D and GY and move that on this side so the ball is stuck in between the two of them all the time. So if that one's called base, then this one should be called top. Okay. So again, make sure it's set to invisible, and then under maximum texture drawer, say wireframe, and same with this one, wireframe. So now we go back to 1. So now we've got 2 plates, like 2 glass windows, in front of and behind of our game objects, and they're gonna, when the ball starts moving around, they'll keep the ball in there. So let's add our ball. So UV sphere, I'll give it 16 and 16 segments. Set it to be smooth. It's too big, so we scale it down. Now I'm just going to look from the side because it should fit inside these 2 black lines, which are like our panes of glass. So we'll, give it a little bit of room each side. So that's our ball, and let's call it ball. Now we're going to give this a new material, and we'll call it ball. Material is just like a color and the attributes of the surface of the object. Now let's have a look at its physics properties. So we want it to be a rigid body, we want it to bounce around, and we want its collision to be a triangle mesh. So we want it to follow the mesh, the shape of the mesh. Now we don't want it to have any damping. Damping is basically friction, so what we don't want is it to hit the wall or hit the paddle and then slow down and basically just stop. So that would be not a good game. this here at the moment, the radius, we've used that before. That doesn't matter because we've set it to be the collision, to be the mesh. And if you wanted the ball to behave like a heavier object or a lighter object, so its velocity to go faster or slower, you could change its mass. The other thing we're interested here is angular velocity. So we want it to have a minimum angular velocity of 10 and a maximum of, say, 15. And that just ensures that it keeps moving. Again, we don't want the ball to stop under friction. Most so it's a rigid body, it's behaving like something in the real world, affected by physics in the real world. When you're not in space, that is, you're eventually slowed down by friction, by air friction or surface friction. Okay, so now let's look at the material. So this is sort of the attributes of the surface of the ball. So we can make it a color, so we'll make it red, make it any color we want. But down here we have game settings and physics settings. So again, it's got friction, so I'm going to turn off the friction, and we're going to turn up its elasticity, which is sort of like how much it bounces by. And we want to do the same on these guys here. We want to turn down the friction and turn up the elasticity. So friction down, elasticity up. Very good. Next of all, we want to take our ball, we want to move it to layer number 2, and then this is our empty, and our empty is going to be how we start the game. So we're going to go keyboard input, spacebar to start, and we'll type in start here. Okay, and this is going to use the edit objects actuator, and we're going to add an object. What object we want to add? The ball. There it is. And again, we want to give it a linear velocity. Let's say we fire it this way of, so we said minimum 10, maximum 15, so let's say 12. So let's go P, play the game, and hit spacebar. Okay, so something very dramatic has happened. It has fallen. And why is that? Well, that's because we forgot to turn off gravity. So let's set gravity to 0. And now P, spacebar. Okay, so it hit the paddle, and then that had a dramatic effect on it. This is not an exciting game. Okay, so let's see what we can do. So let's increase the elasticity on our paddles. Let's do, yeah, we've done the same with the wall. Now the reason they're all the same is because they all have the same material. So let's look at the physics of these. So static, okay, very good. And we'll make these triangular mesh as well, just so it's a bit more accurate. Now we'll have a look at our ball, and it's got a mass, so we'll reduce its mass a little bit, so let's say 0.2. So this is, we're going to turn this to 0, and we are going to go back and have a look. Okay, sorry, I set its angular velocity to 10. So this is how much it spins, not how fast it moves. So simple mistake, rookie mistake. And we'll turn up its elasticity as well. So let's go back to this here, P and spacebar. So there we go. So it's moving, and that's all good. Now we can go to the empty here, and we can add a angular velocity, so we can spin it. So let's just go to spin, press P, spacebar, and you can see it spun there, and fairly unpredictably as well. So we may have to tweak these a little bit so that the ball moves in a more interesting way. We also have to be careful that these two panes of glass, shall we call them, aren't too close, and I think I have a feeling they're a bit too close. We may have to move them out a little bit. But before we do that, because this is only a basic game and we're 15 minutes in and I want to keep this nice and simple, So we said when something collides with this, send the message to the game controller. When something collides with this, send the message to the game controller. So let's put a score into our game. So what message are we sending? So when this has a collision, it sends this here, score pad 1. So we're going to add game logic. So we're going to go so pad 1 score. So that's just to tell me what I'm doing. So when I receive the message, score pad 1. Now it's very important that we get this correct. If I use capitalization, if it was a capital S or it was a space between the D and the 1, and we didn't have exactly the same syntax or spelling here, it would not work. So when I receive this message, what do I want to do? Well, I want to add 1 to the score. So I'm going to call this, I'm going to add a property, and I'm going to call it player 1 score. I'm going to make it an integer, so it's a solid number. And I'm going to turn this on here, which is print debug information, so show me this information. Now in a future tutorial we'll turn this into something more appealing in terms of graphics, but for now we just want to see it working. So when I receive this message, I want to perform an action, and the action is change this property. Which property? That property there. Add something to it, so, and we'll add a score of 1. Okay. So when the ball hits this wall, it'll send a message to the game controller. The game controller will receive this message, score pad 1, and then it will add 1 to player 1 score. And now we have to repeat that. So I'm going to press control up and go full screen so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to go message, and this was score pad 2. So this is pad 2 score. And over here I'm going to add property. Again, it's going to be add. Let me add 1. But I don't have a player 2 score, so I'm going to have to add a new game property here. Again, I'm going to call this player 2 score. Again, make it an integer, and we started at 0. So add 1. Okay. Now we've got a score. We've got a scoring system. The other thing we want to do is we want to restart the game after we've scored, because we don't want, for example, the ball to go bing 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 between the paddle and the back wall and this player suddenly to rack up 12 points. So what we want is to give this wall a property, and we're going to call it death. Quite dramatic. Same over here. Death. Okay. Now we're going to go to our ball, which is on layer 2, and we're going to say on collision, when I collide with something with the property depth, okay, then over here we're going to go edit object, end object. So this is die. Okay, so let's just have a little think about that. When it collides with an object that has the property death, it deletes itself, it ends itself. So the ball will miss the paddle. It can hit the paddle, but on the collision with the paddle it won't do anything, because the paddle does not have this property. So it can hit any number of things. It can hit the top wall, the bottom wall, and both paddles, and it will not delete itself. Only when it hits an object with this property will it delete itself. So let's see that in motion here. So we'll go P to enter the game engine, spacebar. I'm going to move this paddle up, and it's deleted itself. Now we want to see the score. We can't see the score, so up here we go game, show debug properties. Now I just want to make sure I've turned one of these on but not the second one, so I'll turn that on as well. So now we'll go full screen, T and N to get rid of those, and we press P to play the game. Now up in the top left corner you can see it says player 1 score, player 2 score. So I can go spacebar, and player 2 has now scored. I can go spacebar, and player 1 has now scored. Also I can pass through the walls. Minor problem, I can easily fix that. Spacebar. Now we have other kind of problems with this game, because I can do this, spacebar, and suddenly it becomes a more interesting game. And I can, I am actually trying to play against myself, which is a lot harder than it first appears. Okay, and before I embarrass myself completely like that, I'm going to hit escape and stop. So that's a game of Pong. There is an objective to get the highest score. There's a ball that will bounce and follow physics. We have player 1 and player 2 input. They can move the paddles. When the ball collides with the wall, it disappears, and also 1 is added to the score. So the basic kind of tenets of this game, the basic components of it, are at the heart of all games. So there's a clear objective, and it's about passing messages between objects. So a message passing from this wall to the ball to say, delete yourself, and also on collision, a message going to the game controller saying, add 1 to the score for this player. So there's a lot of things in this game that you will use again and again and again as you develop games, be they in the Blender game engine here or in other more complex game engines.